Let me welcome you all here today for this seminar. It's great to have you with us, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce to you Professor Liz Jackson, who will be giving today's seminar, Beyond Virtue, the Politics of Educating Gratitude and Humility. I've known Liz for a number of years now, and it's nice to be chairing this for her because we actually first met at a PISA conference many years ago. I think you'd been in Hong Kong at HKU for about 1 year at that stage, Liz, and I was doing my PhD in Melbourne. And so we've been in touch ever since then. And Liz is known to many of you, so I'll keep my introduction brief. But fortunately for me, Liz is now my colleague here at the Education University of Hong Kong, where she's Professor in the Department of International Education. She's the past president of PISA and the previous director of the Comparative and Education Research Centre out of HKU. She has an enviable publication record that comprises a large number of articles and books that consider political and cultural issues in education from a philosophical perspective. Some of her most recent books include Questioning Allegiance, Resituating Civic Education, and Contesting Education and Identity in Hong Kong, as well as the book on which today's seminar is based, Beyond Virtue, the Politics of Educating Emotions. Liz is leading a research project here at EdU in which the team is exploring a wide range of issues related to gratitude and humility in education. And this is just about to get underway. And as a former secondary school teacher myself, I've long been interested in the ways in which well-being and positive education movements have been taken up in schools. And in trying to discuss and question these movements with many, but certainly not all of my colleagues, it was very common to get a response that effectively communicated to me, hey, don't question well-being, don't question gratitude journals, because whatever issues there might be, these are essentially good things, and we wouldn't want to critique that sort of stuff in any way whatsoever. So in my days in the secondary schools, I had just a few people, some of them are actually here with us today, who I could talk to about these kinds of things. And so with that in mind, I'm absolutely thrilled that Liz is doing this work and bringing colleagues along with her for the ride. And I'm thrilled that we have school teachers and leaders with us in this seminar today, and looking very much, Liz, to what you have to say about the politics of educating gratitude and humility. Liz will speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'll open up for questions and comments. So without further ado, Liz, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. And thank you also for helping to organize this session, along with my colleagues here, Emily Mong and my other colleagues in the Department of International Education. And thanks also, Steve mentioned the PISA Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia. So for people who couldn't make this time, this session will be recorded and put on the PISA Agora website later on. So great to see the interest in this topic. And I started working on this research before the COVID crisis began. And now you see more than ever this focus on well-being and everyone needing well-being, everyone needing resilience. And so it's a good opportunity for my book in this case, and for people who are interested to really start digging into these issues and thinking through more critically, why are we educating for certain emotional experiences or not? So I will now share my screen here from the beginning. Yes. Okay. So my book, as Stephen mentioned, it discusses the politics of educating emotions, and I go through a wide range of emotions in the text. But here I'm just going to discuss two interesting emotions that are examples and sort of case studies for the sorts of thinking that I want to do about educating emotions, gratitude and humility. So I'm going to discuss some different ways of thinking about emotions. In particular, there's 3 ways to think about emotions in education that I want to highlight, and then sort of apply that thinking to show what it really means more specifically for educational theory and practice with the examples of gratitude and humility. So there has been two major views of emotions which have really influenced educational discourse on emotions historically and today. The two prominent ones have been psychological and philosophical views. And here I want to also emphasize a third possibility and another important way to think about emotions, which is political. These aren't all the ways you could think about emotions. So one thing I think about is anthropology. Anthropology also, has something to say about emotions. Economics, new economic theories have something to say about emotions. But these are some of the discourses I think are really important when we think about educating emotions within the context of schools and our contemporary societies. So starting with a psychological view, there can be no doubt that psychology has played a fundamental role in helping people understand emotions generally in society and how to educate for them in schools. So for some people, they might not necessarily assume that emotions are part of education. And that's one assumption that I tackle right away in my book. Education does deal with emotions. A lot of times it's underneath the surface, but it's also revealed in policy statements. And that's becoming more obvious today. A few decades ago, people would say, education is about knowledge and information and becoming intelligent. And in that context, a psychological view of emotions tends to emphasize what is often called academic emotions. So academic emotions should be related to enabling learning from students and also ameliorating those negative emotional experiences that are going to be barriers to learning, right? So children being angry and stubborn and hyperactive and sad are seen as hindrances to learning, and being motivated and curious and open-minded are thought of as academic emotions that will be helpful in the context of schooling. And there's a history of this. It was called originally mental hygiene in the United States. There was a massive mental hygiene program in the early 1900s where they emphasized that mental hygiene was one of the most important aspects of education. So this idea of cleaning the mind. So often we don't say emotions here, we might just say mental well-being. That's a term that's often used, but emotions are sort of underneath the surface in that discourse as well. When they were talking about mental hygiene, they were talking about, we don't want people to be angry or flustered. We want them to be calm and ready to learn and focused. So in this context, emotions help to help individuals function within society and within schools, and having the right emotions that sort of complement your success in schools and in society are seen as emotions that we want to pursue. So psychology, and psychology is such a broad field as well. So it's hard to make a lot of generalizations about psychology. But one of the points I want to make in the text is that psychology is limited in some kinds of perspectives, especially when we think about how emotions are social and how emotions take place within social situations. So that's actually something that's a little challenging for psychologists to really get at. And so this is an interesting problem if you think about anxiety, for example. So you can observe anxiety in a student sometimes, but sometimes you can't, right? So someone might feel very anxious, but you can't actually see it. Or somebody could look very anxious, but they say, I don't feel that bad. It's not really a problem for me. So direct observation can sometimes be useful, but sometimes it can be a limitation. So psychologists will also then refer to what people talk about, what they report about a situation that can be through counseling and through discussions, or in the case of children in schools, psychologists and counselors might be interested in the views of parents and teachers, because one of the challenges with self-report is people don't always have a rich vocabulary to explain their emotions. Not everyone can really focus on what they feel. So one of the common recommendations for emotional education today is that young people need to be able to understand what their emotions are and communicate that to other people. And that's part of positive psychology and emotional intelligence view, is you need to identify your emotions and then respond to those emotions effectively. Not everyone is good at doing this. A lot of people who understand all the discourse really struggle to do this. So it's by no means something that everyone can become perfectly good at. And a lot of people from a philosophical view, they really question, are we just imagining that people are learning how to do this? So you can imagine in a school situation, young people pretending like they understand their emotions and explaining them to teachers because they think they're supposed to do that. Actually, a lot of people do have a challenge doing that. So that's another challenge when it comes to understanding emotions as processes. So a student might be anxious before they take a test, but they might not be anxious if they have some intervention before the test taking situation occurs. So emotions are situated in this way, and they do change as very dynamic processes. That's also something that makes it very difficult to identify how emotional processes work in terms of direct observation. You can't really directly observe emotions in real situations. And to get into actually real situations, you would need to experiment. So these are sort of some interesting challenges when it comes to understanding emotions from a psychological view. And I think often there's a suggestion in psychological research that some intervention works. And actually, when you dig deep into the methodology and what's really been done, it can actually be really difficult to trace out if an intervention is working or if people are being primed to show that it's working. So in a school situation, young people do want to please their teachers. If they have an intervention, the gratitude is wonderful and makes you feel good, then the young people are going to express that to a researcher. So this is another challenge when it comes to understanding emotions as processes, is this desirability impact. So I mentioned earlier that historically there was a description of emotions in terms of mental hygiene in education. And one of the things I want to foreground when we think about emotions in education from a psychological view is the sense that people are supposed to function within society and they're supposed to function within schools. So oftentimes emotional education is supposed to help teachers do their jobs in a certain sense. So this is a quotation from 1912 New York City High School Teachers Association. This is from one of their just policy documents or newsletters. Comparison between schools and mercantile establishments. The teacher corresponds to planning department or factory. The elements in the enterprise are combined in the pupil. So there's a direct equivalence here between schools and factories. And there's a sense here that young people need the right materials in order to be part of that. So that's a very functional view of young people's position within schools and within society, and emotions helping to fit inside that puzzle to make things run efficiently in general. So I've picked on psychology, but it's not all psychology, and social psychologists know all of this stuff better than I do since I come from philosophy of education. So it's not all psychology I'm talking about here. I'm mostly focused on emotional intelligence and positive psychology. So emotional intelligence became very popular in the 80s, and positive psychology has become popular more recently. Emotional intelligence, as I mentioned, emphasizes identifying your emotions and then responding to them appropriately so that you can function and succeed in school, career, community, and so on. Positive psychology is a different movement, but it's really focused on well-being and happiness. And it's called positive psychology because there's a sense that traditionally psychology is focused on what's wrong with people, and positive psychology is trying to focus on the good things. So that if people are happy, they're going to achieve more, and they're going to be more open to learning. So focusing on how to develop happiness, and gratitude is very much a big part of positive psychology as well at the moment. So these movements have been really influential in education, but they do have some challenges and some limitations. So from a philosophical perspective, there's not really anything very moral here. There is an assumption that if people have the right emotions, they're going to be better people. There is the assumption that if you're happy, then you're going to be nicer to other people. This is an assumption that's widely held, actually. Nell Noddings in Philosophy of Education has also argued very prominently that happy people don't do nasty things, don't hurt other people. You can question that. So that's a claim that is not necessarily valid. People can be happy people and total jerks. And so this is something that really needs to be worked through. There's a lot of research on gratitude saying that people with more gratitude are going to be more giving to other people, but they might be giving to the wrong people. So I'm going to discuss some of those nitty-gritty issues down the road. So there's nothing really moral about it. The people who've been leading emotional intelligence and positive psychology, they have argued that they're like virtues and they're like moral concepts, but they are psychologists, so they're not really focused on good or bad issues. They are focused more on what is functional, and they don't really question what the functionality is. The coherence of concepts has been a challenge. So happiness, being mentally well, having gratitude, all of these things can be deconstructed. And this makes the broad claims that people make about gratitude being important or happiness being important. If you compare each study in the way it's defined, it's not always very coherent. So this is another challenge. As I mentioned before, how do we know that interventions are working? In schools, this is really a challenging one. If you do an intervention to encourage young people to be happy or identify their emotions, they're going to try to please the teacher and try to please the researcher. And so it is hard to know if they're working. And sometimes it seems as if some of the interventions are more about classroom management than about student well-being. And this goes back to the issue of incoherent concepts. And then another limitation is, does it work for diverse students? And diverse students do need different kinds of approaches. So this is something that I think psychologists recognize, is there's not one approach that's going to work for every person when it comes to developing well-being and being a more functional and happy and whole person. People need different strategies. Some people, like I mentioned before, really don't understand their emotions in the way that some people take for granted. So if a teacher takes for granted that everyone thinks the way they do, this can actually be quite detrimental. So this isn't to pick on psychology. The issue here is the way psychology is taken into education. And I've had some really interesting conversations with psychologists about this issue, because some psychologists are working hard to develop positive interventions, and teachers and educators really want those interventions, and they really want them to work. Everyone wants them to work, but some people can be left behind in this situation. So this, we're starting to hint at here now some of the politics, but I'm not going to say too much about the politics quite yet. But this is a quote from my book. So governments have made well-being part of the education agenda in many countries, and recommending positive psychology and emotional intelligence movements. This can be seen as a moral act, particularly if it's helping young people to feel better. But other people argue that this discourse also helps for young people to learn to work hard and be obedient and docile and resilient. So sometimes these interventions and the call for well-being is brought in when people are seeing that there's a disaster like there is right now. And there's the idea that rather than fix the problem that we face, so if people are depressed because of poverty, just making them feel better in schools, okay, that might be a good thing to do, but it might not really be particularly moral. And there's some cases where it's not working, and what's actually happening is young people are just trying to do what they're being told to do. So it can be kind of a pedagogy of control rather than a pedagogy that empowers and frees people. So there's many philosophical views of emotions. There's not just one. Philosophy is a massive field like psychology is. And in the book, I do spend a little bit of time thinking about different philosophical views of emotions. And I think that exploring those different philosophical views also helps us to keep in mind how people really see things quite differently. And not everyone shares sort of some psychological assumptions, and that can be a challenge for making those interventions work as well. So these are some of the philosophical views that I explore in the book, but what I really focus on is virtue ethics, because virtue ethics is becoming very popular once again, and it really goes hand in hand. When there's the call for well-being in education, for happiness in education, virtue ethics frameworks and positive psychology frameworks are really working hand in hand. The philosophers and psychologists in these fields are talking to each other, they're piggybacking off of each other. So I want to spend a few minutes focusing on virtue ethics in particular and its orientation towards emotions in education. So virtue ethics sees things like gratitude and humility as virtues. And so we strive to act in a virtuous way. And when you act in a virtuous way and you are virtuous, there's also a feeling involved with that. So there's an interplay of emotions and rationality in phronesis and virtue ethics from an Aristotelian perception. So in this framework, emotions, you're supposed to feel good when you're doing something good for another person. So you shouldn't just tell the truth because you know it's the right thing to do. You shouldn't just tell the truth because you think people will like you if you are a good person. You should actually feel something good at the same time that you're doing that. So virtues are learned through emulation and habituation, according to this discourse. So young people babies don't really have virtues. So at first there's a process of teaching and instructing and telling people how to be virtuous. Then according to this framework, young people should emulate role models and develop habit. And that can relate to being reflective and accepting imperfection, accepting that sometimes no one's virtuous all the time. So this discourse does not emphasize that you have to be perfect, but that you're always striving to do a little bit better. So Benjamin Franklin famously had a record of his preferred virtues, and he kept a strict calendar and log of when he was virtuous and when he wasn't for years and years and years. If he was being truthful and not gossiping. And so this is a sense that it's a continuous striving to act more virtuous because it's not really human nature to do so. So I mentioned that virtue ethics and positive psychology have been working hand in hand. And you can see this particularly in the work of the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. And the people who work there, they do have a critical conceptualization of virtue. Christian Christensen has written a lot of books thinking about positive psychology and analyzing emotions in education. And so he really does think critically about these things. But there is, in general, you can see a harmony and a complementary approach when it comes to educating for emotions. So there is at the start an identification of what you're feeling and then responding to that appropriately. So this is from one of their guidebooks, like a textbook that students could use in schools. So this for teachers and for students. So if I identify that I'm in a survival zone and my adrenaline levels are high, I want to reduce my adrenaline, do some mindful breathing, increase my serotonin, hang out with my friends, do something funny, so I can affect my emotions in a predictable way. So this is like quite a technical jargon. And I think it already sort of hints at this concern that I have, which is I just don't know. I don't know when I have adrenaline or not. Maybe all of you know how you feel about it. And this is why I wrote the book. But for me, I think this is quite complicated stuff. But from a virtue ethics view, you are supposed to keep working on this so you understand your emotions and you work more appropriately and effectively towards enhancing them to be a better person in society. But there are some challenges and limitations to the virtue ethics view. So a lot of the conceptualization work that's been done in virtue ethics is quite sophisticated, and it's a very large field as well, so it's hard to generalize. But there is, in general, some tendencies that I think we need to be aware of when it comes to applying virtue ethics discourse in education. And these are that people's roles and relations to others are not really considered. And the flip side of that is that identity factors within social contexts, like such as being a man or woman or a girl or boy, are not really considered. So there's just really a sense of people as being universal, general people without digging to the next level of a sociological understanding of emotions within a community context. There doesn't seem to be a focus on cross-cultural differences, which is not necessarily a problem for a virtue ethicist. Virtue ethicists don't say everyone in the world needs to have my view of virtue, but it is a challenge for us when we're teaching because we do have diverse students in our classrooms. I think that's really what got me interested in this topic and writing this book, was recognizing that we have an emotional diversity is one kind of diversity among other kinds. The main challenge for me from a moral or ethical perspective is that the virtue ethics discourse is very oriented towards improving yourself and not really about enhancing or changing the world per se. And this is another way in which it links up with a functionalist psychology view from positive psychology, because there's a sense that work on yourself, you do a better job at being yourself, don't really worry about the rest of it. The rest of it's going to fall in place. Just think about yourself. So that's a problem when it comes to a political or critical orientation to education. So just as one example, Fitzgerald has argued that people should try to cultivate gratitude in every situation. And so he says we should emulate the Dalai Lama. People, and he has examples of women who've been abused, and he says you should find a way to cultivate gratitude in all of these situations. So the focus is not on the situation is bad. Let's look at the situation and let's think about what's wrong with it and how to fix it. The focus is on how can a person still cultivate the virtue of gratitude in this terrible situation. So that's just a certain kind of focus. And I want to challenge that focus when it comes to us educating in a very complicated and problematic world where we don't want to just all do some mindfulness breathing and hope everything's going to be okay. So this brings me to what I discuss as the politics of emotions. So this is more of a view oriented towards social psychology, which thinks more about how people are related to each other in communities, or a sociological view. So the focus is on how is society impacting individuals and how does society impact different individuals in different ways, and how can that be problematic? So from a society level view, society does not function for certain people, for everyone in society equally, and it influences our emotions in a less than ideal state. So from a positive psychology view or virtue ethics view, the individual should just, go into a room and relax and think about what they're feeling and change it. But not everyone's treated the same in society. So I'm quite interested in that aspect of education and emotions. So in schools, students learn to feel belonging or alienation in schools. There's loads of research on this. I'm not the first person to mention this. Teachers may act on bias. So there's recognition today that most people do have unconscious biases as well as conscious biases in many cases. Teachers are going to act on bias and they affect students in different ways. And people learn different expectations about their emotions in school and in life. So girls are expected to show being happy and caring. Boys can be made fun of for showing caring behavior. Teachers might try not to do that, but students learn from each other that you have to be a cool macho boy, you have to be a certain kind of girl. So people do learn these things, and school's one context in which they learn them. And I've written a few articles about this before I worked on this book, this issue, that girls and women are expected to be happy as caregivers in schools. They're expected to be naturally better at caring. In higher education, research shows women get more caught up in service work. Students blame their teachers when they're women if they're not really nice. That comes up in the teaching evaluations, whereas for male teachers, they're just supposed to be outstanding scholars. They don't need to be caring. So these stereotypes are related to generalizations that we have. But when you think about education, these things are things that girls need to reckon with. And if we treat these stereotypes and these generalizations as acceptable and as normal, this also can result in ignoring or dismissing the dispositions of women who might want to be scientists, of men who might want to be kindergarten teachers. So these stereotypes encourage people to feel certain ways that they do not necessarily feel, to feel macho or to feel caring. And this can result in a sense of alienation and cause people, girls and boys, to feel very upset about the situation. So now I want to turn briefly to my two examples, totally different examples, but these examples help to unfold some of the things I've been discussing in a little bit more detail. So gratitude is one emotional virtue that has recently become very popular in positive psychology. There's a sense that gratitude, happiness, well-being, generosity, openness are all correlated to each other and can develop together. So what is gratitude? People do have different conceptions of gratitude, and there is some debate about it among philosophers and among psychologists. In general, it's a feeling of goodwill, thankfulness, favor, or appreciation, and it should be for, traditionally, it should be for a gift that's been freely given that a person wants to receive from someone else. So this is the concept that most people hold about gratitude. There is a targeted sense of gratitude if you narrow it down. So the target is that you're grateful for something. So I think most people all over the world think if a grandmother gives you a gift, you should feel thankful and you should say thank you for that gift. Most people don't find this to be very problematic. However, in positive psychology and with this move towards really focusing on well-being and virtues in education, there is a new trend of this generalized gratitude, which some people say is just appreciation. So you can have gratitude that it's a nice day today, but you're not really grateful to anyone necessarily. So some people say this isn't really gratitude, but positive psychologists do encourage this. Positive psychologists will encourage people to write gratitude journals, and the gratitude journal can be anything. It can be thankful to a person. It can be, I'm glad it's a nice day today. I'm glad that I got some coffee at 7-Eleven, anything like that, where you're not even really grateful to anyone in particular. So actually, among philosophers, there's mixed views about gratitude. Neither Aristotle nor Kant really emphasized gratitude. Both of them thought that to be in a position to receive gifts from other people was a kind of weakness. And they struggled here with knowing that gratitude had a mixed feeling associated with it. Indeed, in research that's been done with groups of people in United States versus United Kingdom, United States people associate gratitude with good feelings, with feeling happy and positive and joyous, and people in UK associate it more with guilt and shame and some other emotions. Likewise, in Confucianism, things are a bit more complex because people have certain relations to each other that are assumed in terms of giving and receiving, and in terms of showing and receiving gratitude from people. So in Confucianism as well, there can be some mixed feelings associated with it in sort of when you think about the actual relation of people to each other. So I mentioned that there's this targeted gratitude and this general appreciation, and the literature on gratitude just goes on and on with a slippery slope where pretty much everything you can think of is a reason to have gratitude. So Saul Smolansky argues that you can be thankful for people not hurting you, because every time you walk by someone, they could kick you and they don't kick you. So therefore, you should be grateful that people are not hurting you. Claudia Card argues that you can be thankful for someone you have a bad relationship with if it's a kind of general appreciation rather than gratitude, because there's this concern with gratitude leading to a sense of humiliation and lack of self-respect. If you're not empowered about your needs and your wants. And as I mentioned before, Fitzgerald argued that you can have gratitude for being harmed, that people should have gratitude even when they've been harmed in certain scenarios, as long as they also have self-respect. So there's been so many defenses of gratitude and so few people questioning gratitude. That was my sense when I first started looking at this literature. And in this context, there's a very strong emphasis on learning gratitude in schools. Why would you not want to do it if it's always good in every situation? So in schools that focus on gratitude, there is recommendations to express gratitude to people, to discuss it, to reflect, make journals about it, think about it, and learn about how gratitude is a good thing. But I do want to push back. There are a few challenges when it comes to gratitude that we should be mindful of as educators. So firstly, it's culturally bounded. As I mentioned before, it doesn't feel good to everyone. It's not the same for everyone. So, and people express and feel emotions in different ways. So these are some challenges if you expect everyone to act the same way about gratitude. It's socialized based on gender, race, and religion. So more research has been done, particularly in the United Kingdom on this. Women tend to think that gratitude is a very important virtue, one of the top 5 virtues that they would want to express, whereas men have it lower down on the list. And my assumption there is that that is an example of education. Education has taught people, not formally, it's not in a textbook that men don't have to have gratitude as much as women do. It's not in the textbook, that people are learning these things in subtle ways in society. And across different religions, there's different views and emphases of gratitude as well. So the socialization is an interesting phenomenon. In this context, it's problematic that in schools, it tends to be treated as universal and in this individual feature that everyone has. Finally, there are some dark sides to gratitude. It can be immoral. If you're grateful that that somebody stole money and gave it to you, or one example people have in the literature, you're grateful that somebody murdered your enemy. So this is not a moral sense of gratitude. So gratitude's not necessarily moral, and the interventions are not particularly convincing for some of the reasons I mentioned before. So here's one example about what I'm talking about when it comes to the individualization of gratitude. In lessons on gratitude, students are asked to describe what a grateful person does and indicate that they will, as individuals, feel gratitude. And then they read a story about Abraham Lincoln, who had gratitude despite the hardships of his life, such as his sister dying. Another curriculum for gratitude asks students to wear blindfolds and make a simple drawing and then point out the benefit of eyesight. So there's just the sense that in every situation, people should have gratitude. There's not really any questioning. So this example about being grateful that you have eyesight, I think this is a really strange one because in effect, the encouragement is to have gratitude for a privilege and an advantage, and not, you're missing an opportunity here to teach a social justice lesson about ability in favor of just, you should feel gratitude inside. Don't think about those other people or the situation, to just feel good about your own situation. So as I mentioned, there's a risk of people feeling joy to have privileges over other people. This can relate to and reflect an accepting of injustice and harm. So it's not uncommon to hear stories of teachers encouraging students to think, you know, we're so grateful, we're so fortunate that we live in nice houses and we have great families and we don't have to worry about money or food or danger or crime or anything like that, rather than thinking about what it means to have a society with inequality and injustice. It can be a challenge for particular groups. I'll say something more about that in a moment. And as an approach to society, one theorist has said that Jesus Christ was actually the first great ingrate in the world because society was asking him and accepting him to indicate and appreciate everything that was happening and say thank you to everyone around him. But he refused to do that because he was challenging the status quo. So as an approach to society, it has been, it can be problematized. Oh, I don't think so I'll just say one more thing about the challenge for particular groups. So there are some people for whom gratitude can be really damaging experience. So for people with some relationship difficulties, for children who are having relationship problems with their parents, emphasizing gratitude can actually be very scary and traumatizing in that case. It can also be difficult for people who don't feel like they have a lot of self-control because the emphasis is not on you having your own ability and self-efficacy. It's about all the other people and what they did for you. And in this context, gratitude can really encourage a general sense of subservience to others and a feeling like I'm nothing, I didn't do anything. So there is a dark side to gratitude. It can be pathological. And I'm maybe talking about 1 or 2% of people here, but if you've taught 100 students, you're going to teach a few of these people. So in this context, if a teacher just says, you have to have gratitude all the time, you should be so grateful for your parents, how can you not have gratitude? It's not going to send the message that it is hoped that it's sending. So that's the interesting thing here. So what we can do in this case, we can consider when it might not be ideal. We can recognize the complex grammar of gratitude. So Liz Gulliford has written a beautiful children's book about gratitude, actually, that shows the complexity of gratitude. And it has stories about one girl gets a pretty necklace from her friend, and then the next day her friend asks if she can cheat off of her test. So then the girl has to think, okay, am I grateful for the gift? What did this gift actually mean? Is it not really a gift? And they work that out. So there are ways to help young people understand that these are complicated things. My main worry here is just when we say, you got to have gratitude, you have to have it all the time, you have to express it all the time. We don't want to do that. And we can prepare for problematic cases and consider those examples where it's not a moral emotion. So I'll just say a few words about humility. And I brought in humility here. I've been thinking about gratitude for many years now, and I've only recently started thinking about humility. Humility per se is not one of the virtues that I focus on in the book. And the reason for that is that the book focuses primarily on feelings which are emphasized in education, and humility is not really emphasized in education. So the book focuses on happiness, compassion, gratitude, mindfulness, resilience, courage, and grit, and then thinks about the negative academic emotions, which are vulnerability, sadness, anger, and fear. Humility is not really emphasized in education, but I think that it should probably play a larger role in our thinking about what we want to cultivate in ourselves and for young people. So humility is about recognition of one's limitations and particularity. So recognizing that your view is not going to be the same as someone else's views, and that you are not perfect and you can't see everything, you can't understand everything. So humility, by those people who are proponents, it is believed to increase well-being and tolerance of difference. People have also promoted cultural, civic, or intellectual humility. So all of these are about being in a group and recognizing that you have one perspective in that group and having a disposition that's open towards others. So just briefly, and I would be very happy to hear if people have thought about this more than me, because I haven't been thinking about this for a long time. I have a sense, if we just do a very basic comparison of Western and Chinese views, that humility is not really emphasized in Western society and history. So Aristotle, liberals, moderns, most philosophers really didn't encourage humility because they thought you should be proud of yourself, you should be rational. So they really equated humility with self-abasement or underestimation. So you have a sense they're kind of macho in this regard when it comes to humility. Education has been seen to decrease humility, and I don't know, I haven't really gone into the studies in depth to explore this, but it kind of makes sense to me if there's a sense that people who are intelligent should be confident, then people who are educated are going to be more confident and probably have less humility. Nonetheless, there are Western proponents of humility that emphasize it to aid in correcting against arrogance and pride. So I think this is slightly different from the view in Chinese philosophical traditions. Humility is embedded in a Confucian view. It aids in hubris and in complacency, and it's really part of self-cultivation, that you can learn from others, that Confucius could learn from a child, that you don't know everything, that you're always improving yourself more. So in this sense, it makes sense to me that it should be seen as a virtue. The self is an impeder and a seeker from the Chinese view, so humility seems to fit in here. What I have written about in the book, which is related to humility, is vulnerability. So I think vulnerability is very interesting. It's an emotion, it's vulnerability. So vulnerability is discussed in all sorts of discourse. It can be, a system can be vulnerable, an environment can be vulnerable. When it comes to an individual, I find the concept of individual vulnerability very fascinating and worth thinking through more deeply. So vulnerability is normally seen as a problem that needs to be remedied, a weakness, a risk, but some critical thinkers who think about vulnerability argue we all have vulnerability. Vulnerability is an existential condition of precariousness, of wanting things and needing things, and as not knowing what's in store for us in the future. So in that context, it can be seen as an ontological characteristic that people should have and hold a sense of vulnerability. So people argue that without vulnerability, you can't really have relationships with other people. You can't really love other people if you're invulnerable. So it's about admitting our interdependence and our connection with other people, and about being open to others, and openness to being wrong and to being at risk. And I also argue in the book that vulnerability can be educational, and that vulnerability is actually an important aspect of education. So learning which transforms is uncomfortable. People who focus on transformative learning emphasize this. So this is one of the challenges to discourse on happiness in education. Sometimes in order to learn and grow, you have to confront things that are difficult and negative and have negative emotions. So if you realize that you're more fortunate than other people in a school lesson, you shouldn't just feel great about that. You should also, it's normal to feel a sense of shame or guilt to some extent. So this is where vulnerability can be helpful. Uncertainty is often reasonable, and it's about treating others as equal and unknowable. And what I emphasize in the book is that we should recognize vulnerability as a community feature, not just an individual feature. So every individual has vulnerability, but communities also do too. And in this context, I argue that we need to circulate vulnerability and recirculate vulnerability. So vulnerability is an ontological characteristic, is not a bad thing. I think the problem is that some people have more vulnerability than others, right? We think about the vulnerable learners, the people vulnerable to disease. So how can we find a way to shift and recirculate that vulnerability? So some people discuss vulnerability as similar to courage, and I explore them next to each other in the book. And people argue that a leader should have vulnerability in order to learn from the people they're leading. That a leader who thinks they know everything is not going to be as effective as someone who really understands that other people might also know things. Meanwhile, there are other people who are endlessly vulnerable in a community context. So if you think of higher education, a temporary worker doesn't really have a say because they're in a precarious space. And so their wisdom is not going to be recognized in a community because of the relations of people to each other. So there's a lot of text here, and I'm just about to wrap up. So people have discussed this when it comes to education, discussing social justice and controversials in education. This is one context where vulnerability can be recirculated. So if you're discussing sexual harassment or sexism in society, in this conversation, women are going to feel more vulnerable than men. They're going to feel more stressed out about it, about what's expected of them. It might remind them of times that they faced sexism or sexual harassment. It's going to make them anxious. Meanwhile, if they have to explain a harassment situation to somebody, the people they're explaining it to are going to not know about the situation. They haven't experienced the situation. In that case, they're not feeling any vulnerability. So how do you flip that? Because this is a case where the gap starts to widen. Because when someone's on the defense, they look more vulnerable. And so people who are trying to explain a social justice issue to other people have to really struggle to know their audience and to reach out to that audience and to learn how to reach out to that audience. People who are oblivious to the problems are feeling very cool and calm and collected about them. So in this context, an educator or a leader, when you're dealing with a problematic issue, a problem within a community, within a school, this is where the vulnerability needs to be recirculated and where we say, okay, the women are the experts on this. If we're talking about, is there racial prejudice or racial harassment, the people at the top of the system are not the experts on this. So the people leading the university are not the people who are experiencing this challenge, so they need to learn from that other group. So Megan Bowler and other people focused on education will say, we need to shift discussions in education to actually increase the vulnerability. So from another perspective, the people on the top or the people in the mainstream, they actually are not able to learn because they're too confident in their knowledge. So for them to be able to learn from others, need to kind of shift the ground under people's feet. So that was something provocative to say as I'm finishing up the talk. So circulating vulnerability across individuals and across organizations. The reason why we should give more people more vulnerability is because vulnerability is not a bad thing. It's a virtue to be open to other people. So vulnerability is only a bad thing if certain people have it, and it means that they have a certain risk. That's what the problem that needs to be solved. So I will end there. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to hear any feedback, any questions or anything else. So I'll finish there. Thank you again.